By the power of Grayskull, I'm not supposed to be here today!
Well, thank you for this very warm welcome, Pauline and Suzanne, for inviting me, and it's really an honor to be with you. Where to begin? So, the overall topic for today is compassion fatigue, which I'll tell you right away, does not exist. There's no such thing as compassion fatigue. The phrase does describe something that's very real, but what it describes is not people being tired of being compassionate. It's something else, and I'll come to that. So today, I turned on the news on my cell phone. And here's an article from Canada from yesterday. Poisoning, concussions, why student violence on teachers is a growing fear. And what the article describes is that throughout Saskatchewan and throughout Canada, there's an increasing reports of adolescents attacking, assaulting their teachers. In Britain, recently it was reported that kids in schools, teachers are reporting large-scale polls of teachers in the UK are showing that teachers are seeing more kids who are distracted, unable to concentrate, and to sit still in the classrooms. The number of kids being medicated for ADHD and anxiety and everything else is going up. In the US at least, the number of kids committing suicide is going up. In the United States at least, last year, more Americans died of drug overdoses, more than twice as many Americans died in 1 year of overdoses than had died in the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan wars put together. Now the number of people diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, inflammations of the body, is going up. We can assume that these are individual pathologies completely unconnected to each other or to anything else, or we can say, there's something going on here that we need to understand if we're going to address it powerfully and accurately. Now, in my most recent book, The Myth of Normal, the argument I make is that if in a laboratory, a scientist was growing organisms in a broth, we call that a culture broth. We talk about culturing organisms. We use the word culture, actually. If in that Petri dish, if in that brew, the organisms were thriving and proliferating properly, we'd call that a healthy culture. If in that same laboratory concoction, the microorganisms were dying or were showing signs of pathology in increasing numbers, we'd call that a toxic culture. Well, human culture is the same. If the organisms in the human culture are showing increasing signs of health, mutuality, inner peace, we'd say that's a healthy culture. But if the number of human beings who are troubled, who are hurting themselves, who are violent towards each other, who are showing signs of pathology of mind and body, or I should say mind-body, because the two can't be separated, then we'd have to say, what is the toxicity in this particular culture? So that's the question that I'm asking. When it comes to compassion fatigue, or what we call compassion fatigue, there are two particular dynamics that we have to look at. One is the nature of the work. What is fatigue, by the way? Fatigue happens when we work too hard. What is work? Work, one way to understand what work is its energy expended against resistance. So if I push my hand through the air like that, that takes very little work. But if I'm pushing my hand against the wall and there's a lot of resistance, I get fatigued very, very quickly. So part of what we call compassion fatigue is energy expended against resistance. And I'll talk about what that resistance is. So one aspect of what we call compassion fatigue is the nature of the work. The other aspect, of course, is not just the nature of the work, but our relationship to the work. So I'll be talking about two aspects today. One is the nature of the work that you're doing, all of you, whether you're in justice field or education, or you're a therapist, or medical work, whatever, childcare work, the nature of the work itself, and the resistances that you're facing. And then the second aspect is your internal relationship to all that. Because we can relate to whatever is happening, either consciously or unconsciously. And the more conscious our response is, the more effective it is, and the more sparing of our own energies. The more unconscious our response is, the more likely we are to get burnt out. So I'll be talking about both aspects. But as I stretched my hand here, I noticed, I was reminded of what I'm wearing here. Let me make a peripheral comment, but it's related. It's related. I think Suzanne was talking about the response to refugees and how defensive the European countries, including the UK, is becoming around the issue of refugees. Well, we can understand that a refugee problem is coming from the outside as a threat to us, or we can put it into historical context, into the context of relationship, including what is the relationship of our particular societies to those refugees that are coming to our shores now. You don't have to agree with me on this one, but I just can't let this one go. And the reason I can't let it go, because I'm so close to it myself. For one thing, I was a refugee myself coming to Canada in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution. For another, 3 weeks ago, I was up in a place called Haida Gwaii. That's where I got this bracelet. This bracelet was given to me as a gift by the people of Haida Gwaii. And I'll tell you why. In the museum here in Glasgow, when my wife Ray and I, who incidentally will be joining me on stage later this afternoon to tell you what's really going on. When Ray and I visited the museum here, we saw a beautiful totem pole from Haida Gwaii, which are islands in northern British Columbia. And we said to each other, what the hell is it doing here? And it's going to be given back. It's going to be sent back. But it was looted from the people of Haida Gwaii by the colonialists. Now, this bracelet was given to me because I did a workshop, a 2-day workshop up in Haida Gwaii with the Haida people. Haida Gwaii, until very recently, was called Queen Charlotte Islands. Now raise your hand if you know who the heck Queen Charlotte was, would you? Anybody? One person. Fantastic. I want you to imagine the person who, it used to be known as Haida Gwaii, then it became Queen Charlotte Islands. So all of a sudden the people of the land who lived there for 13,000 years, all of a sudden we're living in a place called Queen Charlotte Islands. I want you to imagine what it would be like. The chief of Haida Gwaii, the people there, who effected the reversal of the name from Queen Charlotte Islands to Haida Gwaii. When I was growing up, it was Queen Charlotte Islands. More recently, it reverted to its original Aboriginal indigenous name of Haida Gwaii, which means land of the people. The chief who effected that transition is Chief Gujau, with whom I had the privilege of having dinner 3 weeks ago. I want you to imagine what it would be like if the Haida people landed here in what are called the British Isles, in the United Kingdom, and all of a sudden these islands were called Chief Gujau Islands. Then I want you to further imagine if your children went to school and they spoke either Gaelic or English, they'd be beaten up by their teachers. They'd have a pin stuck through their tongue if they spoke their native language. I had an 80-year-old woman, almost 80-year-old woman, come up on the second day of this workshop. And she sits down, I want you to help me, in front of 100 people, of her people. I said, what's the problem? She said, I've forgotten my language. She spoke perfectly good Haida till she was 5 years old, and then she forgot it. And not only did she forget it, even later on when she went to language school to regain her mother tongue, the words don't stick in her brain. And there's nothing intellectually or cognitively wrong with her. You know what happened? When she was 5 years old, she went to school. She had to go to school. These schools that were run by the churches and the state. And she spoke her native tongue. They took a stick and they beat her mercilessly. Age 5. And I said, how did you respond? She said, I said, why me? I was crying, why me? I said, can you say it in Haida? And the words came back to her. And this woman cried out in Haida, I don't know the words. Why me? Why me? And she started shaking. And the shaking that she was exhibiting was exactly the shaking that she experienced as a 5-year-old. And that's not the worst of it. The worst of it was already mentioned on stage here, and Michelle talked about it. The worst of it is that she began to loathe herself. She said, I hate myself. I can't forgive myself. I said, why not? She said, because I was so passive. I was so helpless. I can't forgive myself for being so helpless. Now, you know what the reality is? The reality is that her passivity and her helplessness were the wisdom of her organism that saved her life. Imagine what would have happened if she had fought back. She lightened up considerably, and I said, look, go back to class. I think you'll learn now. And I think she will. But the point I'm making about, not only that, then of course, not only did they deprive these people of their language, then they took their culture. That's why the totem pole is here in Glasgow. It doesn't belong here. When it comes to the refugees, where are these people coming from? 3 days ago, I visited Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is a fantastic mausoleum of history. There are these monuments, statues, eloquent inscriptions to the people that went abroad and oppressed and murdered people all over the world in the name of the empire. Scotland has its own history with the British Empire. It's got its own history both as a subject territory that at times fought very bravely against being suppressed and subjugated, and at times as partners in the colonial enterprise overseas. Both aspects are present here in Scotland, as you know. These refugees, where are they coming from? They're coming from places where climate change has created starvation. They're coming from places where Western intervention has destroyed entire societies and cultures. They're coming from places where during the Iraq War, 500,000 civilians were killed over a lie of weapons of mass destruction. I could go on. And you know what? The book Brave New World, 1984, by George Orwell, you know what it begins with? On the very first pages, if I remember right, there's a scene of refugees dying in the Mediterranean. Do you know how many refugees died in the Mediterranean in the last 10 years? 27,000. Did you know that figure? And if you didn't, how come? Because this society denies what it has done around the world, what it has done to the Haida people. And the Haida people are now having to collect the bones of their ancestors from museums around the world where they were taken as archaeological specimens. And to the Haida people, there's no distinction between the present and the past. The ancestors are with them. And now they're trying to repatriate their ancestors and finding out which families did they belong to, and with what honors and under what signs and with what rituals they should be reburied in their homeland. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying this to blame anybody or to blame anything, but to say it's all interconnected. So these refugees, it's not just a random event. It's an outcome of a relationship. The whole world is interrelated. And we need to look at our role in that, either as recipients or actors in the universal human drama. Now, as I said, there are two ways of understanding things. One is that individualistic view, whether it's biologically or psychology-based, or the view that it's all interrelated. Now, the idea that things are interconnected is not new. In fact, it's ancient wisdom. But let me tell you something about Scotland. So when I was researching the book, The Myth of Normal, I was looking at the impact of certain social factors on individual health. Now, unemployment causes, the anxiety of unemployment causes inflammation in the body, measurable inflammation in the body. And there was a British study, a UK study, that showed that unemployed people had higher levels of inflammation in their bodies and hence were at higher risk for illness. Now, unemployment is not an individual attribute. It's the function of social conditions in a particular kind of economic structure. So the more unemployment, which is a social factor, the more inflammation in the body, which is an individual biological factor. Are the two unrelated, or is it part of the same process? So I mentioned this British study. Unemployment, it was in Scotland, that part of the UK, where unemployment was most endemic and chronic, where the population showed the highest levels of inflammation. That's how connected everything is. This is a recent study within the last decade or two. So, interconnectivity. So the Buddha talked about what he called the interdependent co-arising of phenomena. This is 2,500 years ago. And he said, contemplate the nature of interconnected core rising during every moment. So whatever you, always be aware of the interconnection. And the Buddha's teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, said, it's not that we are, he said, we inter-are. We inter-are. Which has been now proven by modern science, as I'll be showing you. And the Buddha continued, he said, when you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Think of that leaf. You can see it as an individual, separate object, or you can see it as a manifestation of the universe, which actually it is, because the leaf contains the sunshine, doesn't it? Photosynthesis would not happen without photon rays from the sun. The leaf would not exist without the sky, the water that falls from the sky, the minerals from the earth. And the leaf might even be affected by human and animal activity. So that leaf contains the whole world, properly seen. But in the West, we don't see properly. We make everything individualistic. He said, the birth and death of any phenomena are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many, and without the many, there could not be the one. That's what the Buddha said 2,600 years ago now. More recently, an American writer, Susan Griffin, said it this way: because we think in a fragmentary way, we see fragments. So what we see isn't just a function of what's out there. What we see is also a function of how we're seeing. And we now know that the phenomenon observed has a lot to do with who's doing the observing and with what perspective. She writes, the story of one life cannot be told separately from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationships and society. Had we been born to a different family, in a different time, to a different world, we would not be the same. All the lives that surround us are in us, she writes, which is just how she is, which is just how it is. Now to go back to Thich Nhat Hanh, and to go back to this really sad incident with that sycamore tree, let's see what Thich Nhat Hanh says about such things. And he died almost 2 years ago now, one of the great lights in the world. And he said, when you see a child who is well behaved, we may understand that the source and reason for his good behavior is the ground that nurtured him in his community and his family. It is even more important to see the independently co-arising nature of a child who is cruel. Just as with good behavior, the reasons for the child's cruelty can be found in his family, society, school, friends, and ancestors. If we do not shine a light of interdependent co-arising on the child's character, we get angry or afraid and we blame him. We must do our best to understand his interdependent self-nature in order to understand him, accept and love him, and help him transform. And later on, I'm going to show you a very brief video of a murderer in a Texas prison on death row. And you'll see something I think quite extraordinary about the capacity of human beings for transformation. So, let me first of all give you an overall perspective on human development. with this understanding that it's interdependent. Uh, the great American psychiatrist and author who you would do so well to invite here sometime, Dr. Dan Siegel. Has Dan Siegel been up here? Not yet? Okay. Dan talks about the what he calls interpersonal neurobiology. And what Dan did as a psychiatrist, like me in my medical training, because of the limitations of modern medical perspective, at some point I had to look beyond what I was being taught to understand what I was observing. And I'll say more about that later. And this happens to quite a few medical doctors, by the way, that we go through a medical training and then, we appreciate the science and the inventiveness and the brilliant achievements of our discipline, but at the same time, we become frustrated by the limited and narrow perspectives that we've been taught. So we start looking beyond it. And that's what happened to me. And that's why I'm standing in front of you now. It happened also to Dan. And Dan, as a psychiatrist, realized that they're dealing with the mind all the time, but there wasn't even a common definition of what the mind even is. So he brought together archaeologists and psychologists and psychiatrists and neuroscientists and historians and sociologists and, did I say psychologists, people from all different disciplines, even quantum physicists, I think, they're trying to understand the mind. And they came to the understanding that the human mind isn't a separate entity, that the individual human mind is actually a manifestation of an interconnected process, and that human minds and human brains affect each other. So right now, whatever state your mind is in, and you just might want to take a notice of it, what state is your mind in? Is it calm? Is it open? Are you upset by some of the things I've said? Are you in agreement? That's a manifestation of the interactivity of my particular mind with your particular mind at this particular moment. And my mind is certainly affected by the fact that there's hundreds of people looking at me wondering what the heck am I going to say next. So it's also all interconnected. So he talks about interpersonal neurobiology, which led me to take that one step further, because I'm not a psychiatrist. In fact, you know what, the London Evening Standard had an article about me yesterday, and they said I was a psychiatrist, and I had to call them up and say, look, thank God I'm not, you know. No knock on individual psychiatrists, many of them who do heroic work with deep understanding, but as a discipline, oh boy, they just don't get it. And I don't mean because of individual failure, but because they function as all medicine functions within a certain ideology. I mean, think of the medical disciplines as scientific disciplines, and of course they do absorb and beautifully utilize a lot of science, but it's also an ideology. An ideology, by definition, is a certain point of view, a certain way of looking at it, things, which includes some things but excludes others. And psychiatry and modern medicine are ideologies as much as they're sciences. An ideology, once you're inside an ideology, you don't realize that you're inside that ideology. You think you're looking at reality, and you're not aware that you're looking at that reality from a certain perspective. And I have to remember, what the heck was I saying before? What was I saying before I started ranting up? Sorry? Oh, Dan Siegel, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right, thank you. I do have an ADD, you know. uh, so when Dan talks about interpersonal neurobiology, as a physician, I take that a step further. Interpersonal biology. Not only are our brains wired together, our physiology is wired together. That example I gave of inflammation in the Scottish population due to higher levels of unemployment, that's an example of interpersonal biology. That our biology is actually affected by our relationships. So when Suzanne, in her introductory comments, talked about the necessity of relationship in healing, we also have to understand that the problems themselves that relationships can solve were all created in the first place by relationships. So in 1939, at Harvard University, oh, by the way, let me just riff a bit here on Hungarian doctors, okay? I was born in Hungary. 3 days ago in London, Ray, my wife and I saw a play called Dr. Semmelweis by starring this great actor, Mark Rylance, who we had the pleasure of meeting afterwards outside a pub across from the theater. And Dr. Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician, one of my heroes growing up. And my heroes were always the contrarians and the rebels, you know, and he was one of them. He was one of them. I mean, one of my favorite movies is Braveheart, you know, and I know that historically it's not entirely accurate, but boy, I wish it was, because I love those rebels, you know. Anyway, Semmelweis was a Hungarian-born physician working in Vienna in the 1840s. And he noticed, and he delivered babies. He was an obstetrician. There were 2 wards in the Vienna hospital, one of the most important hospitals in the world. There was a ward where the babies were delivered by midwives, and another ward where the babies were delivered by physicians. And the death rate from what they called puerperal fever or sepsis, post-birth infections, was much higher on the doctor's ward than on the midwife's ward. For years and years and years this went on. And Semmelweis came to the striking realization that the doctors would be doing autopsies on infected corpses. And then when the woman went into labor, they dash across to the maternity ward and deliver the babies without washing their hands. Now this may seem obvious to us today. It was revolutionary in those days. And this is before Sir Joseph Lister, about 20, 30 years before Lister discovered the germ theory of disease. So Semmelweis hypothesized that there's some kind of matter that's being passed on from these corpses onto these women. But he didn't know what that was. They didn't know about bacteria then. And people said, and so he actually had the doctors wash their hands, and the death rate went down dramatically. And the resistance on the part of the medical profession was vociferous and violent. He was laughed out of the profession. His findings were demeaned. He was attacked. Now, he was a troubled guy. He ended up dying 2 weeks after being committed to a mental health institution. And you know what he died of? They beat him. He suffered a wound. It got infected, and he died of sepsis. In Budapest, 20 years later, 30 years later, his views were totally validated by science and by experience. And thousands of lives were saved. In Budapest, there's a statue, and I grew up looking at that statue. The reason I mention this is because part of the problem that you're facing is the resistance to truth. That resistance to truth is not over. It did not end with the experience of Semmelweis and his subsequent vindication. That whenever there are views that arise that threaten the way things are, you're going to get a pushback. So these days, even though, as Michel pointed out, the ACE studies and their implications have been fully validated by experience and by science, there's tremendous pushback against the very idea that trauma is any kind of a significant force. The average medical, and I'll tell you later what trauma is, the average medical student does not receive a single lecture on trauma. Not a single lecture, almost anywhere in the world. And yet trauma, I'm going to argue, as science shows, is a major factor in mental health conditions and in most chronic physical health conditions as well. But there's tremendous pushback. When I did my interview with Prince Harry back in March, which was quite the experience itself, the London Times, this is beautiful, beautiful language, they called me overbearing, stern, literal merchant of pain. That's who's standing in front of you right now. 3 months later, 3 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, The Spectator, another British paper, had an article about the cult of trauma. The cult of trauma that has to be ended before it takes over the mental health field. God forbid. Naturally, they mentioned me as one of its most egregious perpetrators. Addiction, according to this article, had nothing to do with pain. So there's tremendous pushback. And you're facing that pushback. And I know that 4 or 5 years ago, when you had Nadine Burke-Harris here, and then you had me up here, and then you had Fritzi Horstman here from the Compassionate Prison Project, there may have been a certain enthusiasm, and I kind of thought, oh boy, they're going to find out, you know, because you thought that all we have to do, I don't know if you thought this, but there's a tendency, I used to think this, that all we have to do is present the truth to people, and they're going to say, thank you very much. No, they ain't, because that truth threatens them on a certain level. So part of what you're experiencing as compassion fatigue is just a pushback that you're going to face for the truth that you're trying to express and embody in your work. So that's part of the fatigue. But to go back to Hungarian physicians, in 1939, there was another Hungarian doctor called Soma Weiss, and Soma Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, taught at Harvard. And so honored and revered was he, and is he even now, that to this day, every year, there's a Soma Weiss Research Day at Harvard, where people present new research under the aegis of this commemoration of this highly venerated teacher. And Soma Weiss, in 1939, gave a lecture to the medical school class at Harvard, in which he said that emotional and psychological and social factors are at least as important in the arising of disease as physiological factors, and they must be at least as important in the healing of them. Now, when he said this, he didn't have a whole lot of science, but he saw what he saw. Now, somehow I said this at Harvard. Every year they honor him with this Soma Weiss Day, and 4 or 5 years ago, I was interviewing a psychiatrist at Harvard, one of Harvard's leading psychiatrists, and he said that to this day, to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard is to jeopardize your career. And Weiss's article, by the way, was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1940. So 80 years after he said this, his views, he is venerated and his views are totally disregarded. That's the state of the profession. That's what Michelle was talking about in relationship to her own physician. In 1977, there was an American physician and a psychiatrist called George Engel who said that our view of health is really inadequate because we separate the mind from the body. By the way, you know who the first person was to criticize doctors for separating the mind from the body? It was Socrates, 2,500 years ago, who said that the problem with the doctors of today is they separate the mind from the body. They don't see the whole. So this is endemic in Western culture. And George Engel called for what he termed a biopsychosocial approach, which understands that human biology is inseparable from psychology and from people's social conditions, which I've already given you one example of. And what tends to happen, you'd think that when people come up with these great insights, the reception would be enthusiastic and they would transform. But the system has got its own ideology, it's got its own purposes, it's got its own intentions. And it's almost impenetrable. And again, it's going to continue that way for a long time. So in considering your own work, to the extent that you align with a view of reality that Suzanne talked about, that Michelle talked about, and that I'm trying to convey here, to the extent that you align with it, expect resistance. Expect that it's not going to be appreciated necessarily or even understood. And that really magnifies the difficulties that you're facing. Because not only are you dealing with a traumatized population, and everybody you deal with is traumatized, otherwise you wouldn't have to be dealing with them. Pretty much. All the troubled kids, all the mentally ill people, or so-called mentally ill people, all the people who are acting in ways that are harmful to themselves or to other people, they're all traumatized. And so not only are you having to deal with people that are very troubled in themselves, but you're also having to do so to one degree or another in institutions and organizations and in a larger culture that's not very open and perhaps even resentful of the way you see things. And that's very difficult. So, and that's not going to change overnight. Which is not to say that you should be discouraged or somehow dissuaded from your path, but it does mean that you have to be realistic about the context that you're facing. Well, I'll go on and get into some more specifics, but let me just stop here for a moment and see if there's any questions what I've said so far. And by and large, when I open it up for questions, my request is that you ask me about what I've talked about, not what I haven't talked about yet, okay? Because I'll have plenty more to say as the day goes on. But if there's any questions on what I've said so far, raise your hand, and I believe there are mics that are going to come around to you so you can voice your question. So just take a moment. Anybody have anything to say or to ask? Yeah. And I am hard of hearing, especially in Scotland. I don't know. Maybe it's the way you people speak. I have no idea. But so please speak slowly and loudly, okay? And okay, there's some hands up. So where are the mics? Yeah, the mics are coming. So raise your hand again. Yeah.
How do we get the doctors to actually listen?
Sorry, where are you?
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
How do we get the doctors to actually listen and take on board that the mind and the body are actually connected through trauma?
Say that again. The doctors, what?
How do we get the doctors
How do you get them?
understand that the mind and the body
Okay, got it,
are
yeah.
connected?
I don't know.
Got you?
What I do know is that within a profession, among certain individuals and large groups of doctors, there's more and more recognition of this stuff. So there's mainstream medicine, but there's also something called integrative medicine that has been developed that takes this into account much more. But if you're asking about the mainstream, look, what I can tell you is the news is both good and bad. Is that I get invitations to speak all over the world. What I rarely get are invitations to speak to medical doctors, you know. But this year they started coming in for some reason, you know. I'm almost 80 years old, and I've finally been discovered, you know. And so I'll be coming back to the UK in March to speak to a group of doctors about mental health and trauma. But and this is happening increasingly, not just to me, but in general. What I can tell you is that trauma awareness is rising in the population, as we can see by this conference here. But the last bastion of absorbing that awareness is the medical profession. Now, why is that? I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, somebody once said, somebody once asked the question, how do you build a cult? Well, first of all, you separate people from their families, you sleep deprive them, you give them a special jargon that only they can understand, you put them under authoritarian leaders, and you make them feel unique. In other words, you send them to medical school, okay? Now, that's point number one. Point number two, medical school for a lot of participants is highly traumatizing. There's a very interesting study that was done. There's something called telomeres or telomeres. Telomeres are structures of DNA at the end of our chromosomes. And they're like the aglets at the end of my shoelaces, glue to keep the chromosomes from unraveling. And we're born with a certain number of telomeres, certain number of units. And stress and aging shortens the telomeres. And the shorter the telomeres, the more you are prone to illness and to pathology in general, or to death. By the end of our lives, our telomeres are quite short compared to the newborn. They looked at the telomere length of medical residents and how much they shortened within a year or two compared to other people their age. And the telomeres of the medical students frayed more rapidly than those of other people their age. It's a highly stressed profession. It's a highly stressed profession. That's the second point. The third point is who goes into medicine. By the way, not just who goes into medicine, who goes into the helping professions in general. Speaking to all of you here. I tell you why I went into medicine. One, I really wanted to help people, as do all of you. Number two, more selfishly, I want to make a good living and have a secure existence. Those are all legitimate goals, and they're not to be dismissed. But there's a third goal that I had that I wasn't aware of, which is to make myself important. Why did I want to make myself important? Because I didn't value myself. Michelle talked about that. Now, when I mentioned that indigenous woman, the Haida woman, who loathed herself for having been so passive, as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the impacts of trauma is that you lose a sense of your own value. So the more I lack a sense of my own value, the more I want to validate my existence through what I do and how other people respond to me. A lot of doctors, for all the genuine reasons, humanitarian reasons, that impel them to go into that particular profession, and I should generalize this to people in the helping professions overall, there's often also an element of needing to be important. And I'll talk more about that later. But the result is that then you start to identify with your role and how you see things. You're not going to accept, oh my God, so for 20 years I've been practicing medicine in a certain way, and somebody comes along with a new point of view, and I'm going to say, oh God, thank you, now I understand things better. No, you're going to defend your point of view, because your self-importance is dependent on what you've identified with. So it's a very tough nut to crack. And I don't spend too much of my time worrying about how to do it. I just encourage you as well not to. I mean, if you have good relationship with certain physicians and you're in a position to have an open-minded conversation, by all means, please do it. But don't beat your head against the wall. Just do your work, demonstrate its value, speak your truth. As a very wise man once said, those that have ears will listen. And those that don't have ears, well, not much you can do about it. Okay? That's that my answer, yeah? Okay? Yeah?
Hi. I'm a bit nervous to admit that I'm a medical doctor after...
That's okay.
But I really felt I needed to speak and say, firstly, thank you for coming to Scotland. I'm a bit nervous. And that I
So you
agree.
said you're a medical doctor?
Yes, yes.
How many lectures did you receive on trauma?
I've never received a lecture on trauma.
Yeah.
And the reason I've learned about trauma is that I've had a very traumatic experience being a doctor.
Yeah.
And I think many, many doctors are traumatized by the experience of going to medical school,
Yeah.
which is, for me, I recognise now was a traumatic experience. Medicine attracts people who feel they have little value.
Yeah.
And I was encouraged to go to medical school because I was seen as intelligent, and it was a way to please my parents.
Yeah.
And so, and you're right, it is a cult, and I was part of that cult for many years. And I eventually realised it was killing me, and I needed to speak up about things that I saw that I didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And you are right about the pushback that causes. And what I was going to say was, how do we get the other doctors to listen? That was my question. Could I ask how many other doctors of medicine there are in the room? Because I'd love to meet you. Because probably aren't very many. There's another one over there.
Okay, yeah, would the doctors stand up for a moment?
So yeah, I wanted you to know that there are doctors that are interested in your work. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not in that field, but I have recently asked for trauma-informed care from my medical... so thank you for speaking.
So thank you, and thank you for identifying yourself and for asking your colleagues to identify themselves, because you need to support each other. It can be a lonely slog, you know, and so you need to support each other. So the more you can communicate, get to know each other, advocate together, the more powerful your work is going to be. So thank you for that.
The only way anyone on the internet would care about this old-timey bullshit is if you shot a TikTok trying to jam one of those Jesus kites up your Christian dick hole.
Asshole.
Thank you.